History Project here at Rutgers Newark. I'm an associate professor in the history department. And I will introduce our speakers today, and I'll just say a quick word first about the Queer Newark Oral History Project for anyone who's not familiar with it. We've been working since 2011 to try to document and preserve Newark's LGBTQ history, which historically has not been very well preserved, although we'll be speaking to a pioneer in the preservation of it today. So when we got started, we really wanted to create an historical archive. What we saw was that there were these rich memories that were just not being preserved and then not entering the historical record. Often people's stories would die with them, or their memory would be passed on only to a few friends and not publicly available. And the stories are so fascinating. Transgender histories of Newark, interracial queer relationships, political protest. It's a story that most people don't know, even today, and I think it's pretty enlightening and exciting to be part of. And so for anybody who's interested in that, the website is queer.newark.rutgers.edu, but if you just Google Queer Newark, it's the top hit. So anyway, a few years ago we created a bibliography of scholarly works about LGBTQ Newark history, and there wasn't a lot out there. So I was sort of tasked with formulating this bibliography, and there's some really good work, don't get me wrong. People like Peter Savastano, who writes about gay Catholic men in Newark, for instance, but not a ton. And so I'm playing around on the internet, just Googling, playing on Google Scholar, and I come across this article. Listen to this: Queering Political Economy in Neoliberal Ironbound Newark, Subjectivity and Space-Making Among Brazilian Queer Immigrant Men. And I was like, what? How did I not know this existed? Who is this person? Yamil Avivi. I'm very excited about this. And I've assigned it in class since then. Students were super into it. It's a great ethnography of sort of very different queer experiences of these immigrant men. And so over time, I came to realize Yamil had also written other pieces about things like queer Brazilian TV representation and how it's received in Newark's Ironbound, as well as other non-Newark topics like Colombian gay asylum seekers in Miami. And so over the years, I think we just kind of eventually set up an email correspondence, sort of began to get to know one another, and then eventually it kind of culminated in this. We were like, well, we need to bring you here because we're working on a book about queer Newark history, an edited collection, and you really need to be part of it if you're willing, because this is really exciting work. I mean, nobody else is doing this kind of stuff. And so that's what brings us to our speaker today. I guess I sort of already introduced him here a bit, but Yamil Avivi got a master's degree at New York University, a PhD at the University of Michigan, and has really been doing pioneering work in queer Latinx studies. And so I'm very excited. I'll let him talk about his project because he'll be talking about it momentarily anyway. And so Yamil's going to give an academic paper, and then we're going to have a sort of discussion and response section. And Victoria Borges from the Ironbound Community Corporation, who is volunteer and community partnership coordinator and doing really cutting edge work in queer community organizing here in Newark and Ironbound now, so it fits so well with the work that Yamil is doing. We'll respond to it. I might have a few comments, and then we'll kind of open it up to a discussion and Q&A. I think it can be kind of informal. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Yamil Avivi.
So much. It's such an honor to be here with you guys. I'm 43. Oh, yep, I got my age out. And honestly, being in my mid-20s and thinking where this is today, being able to talk to you guys about two publications that I did is just really exciting. And it really, it's an interesting voyage of engagement with folks who were undocumented at first, and then some of them have legalized, and I'm going to discuss more about it in my paper. So I guess I'll just start going to my paper. Okay. Since 2004, I have observed how the Ironbound neighborhood and its Lusophone majority, Portuguese and Brazilian immigrant inhabitants, are exceptionalized, similarly and differently as good ethnics within the context of African American and Puerto Rican majority Newark. I have examined in previous publications how the state has marked these immigrants as good ethnics of neoliberalism or heteronormative model figures of individual self-sufficiency, success, worth, and good citizenship amidst the recurring narrative of Newark urban decay and white flight since the city's civil riots. Geographically, the Ironbound has remained as one of the tucked-away, racialized white neighborhoods of the city, and therefore the bodies in this neighborhood are often read and policed as heteronormative bodies, resembling a heterosexual, often whitened and traditional middle-class sensibility and modest sexuality of individual life and family, vis-a-vis most of the rest of racialized brown and black Newark. In my previous essays, I discussed the ways in which the Ironbound Portuguese and Brazilian population achieved the heteronormative status, state-run neoliberal narratives of individual immigrant market success that bring, quote, rebirth and growth for Newark. In light of this, I examined how this immigrant heteronormative narrative aligns and limits the sexual diversity in the neighborhood. In effect, my previous research offered queer immigrant narratives through ethnographic interviewing that fell outside existing narratives of Brazilian immigrants in the Ironbound. Even more, my past findings demonstrated a subtle and low profile of most queer, undocumented Brazilian immigrants within the market and nightlife spaces, particularly in central points of the neighborhood along Ferry, Wilson, and Market Streets, as well as the attempts to start a social political organization. Now, in 2019, I am revisiting these findings to understand how queer immigrant life within a majority Lusophone and burgeoning Hispanophone Brazilian Ironbound context may have changed or stayed the same based on the ethnographic interviewing and fieldwork I conducted 10 years ago. This past summer, I re-interviewed a few of my former interviewees from 2009 who either continue living in the Ironbound, such as Joe Wilson, Nelson, and Danilo, who I get to in the interview, in this paper more thoroughly, or who left, Carlos, who moved to Florida with his husband. Along the way, I rekindled with a past acquaintance, Byron, who I did not interview previously. Through Joe Wilson, I also met a Brazilian man, Fernando, who is Joe Wilson's co-worker at a place that I call a Bom Pão, which is a bakery on Ferry Street. It's a fictitious name, and who married a Dominican man after 2 years of dating and living together in South Hackensack, New Jersey. Overall, my ethnographic interviewing and fieldwork this past summer, 2019, in the Ironbound suggests that the Ironbound neighborhood has grown queer-friendlier and more visible. There are several reasons why, according to my interviewees. First, a later immigration of queers who are already out from Brazil add to a neighborhood where queer culture has been paved earlier, even if it was subtle or tacit. But Carlos Descenda uses this term, this kind of silent subtleness of queer immigrant culture in Latino neighborhoods. Second, the Ironbound is a shared and densely populated neighborhood that everyone has to share, and thus visibility is eminent. Third, some of my interviewees, particularly Joe Wilson and Fernando, who are feminine in appearance, who have lived and worked within the neighborhood market, have achieved status, familiarity, and belonging even amidst the heteronormative majority. For example, I experienced this when walking on Ferry and Wilson streets with these men. Several men and women, either queer or straight, either waved hello to us on the street with a smile or initiated conversation with us. These men were not marginal, but highly familiar to those on the street. More importantly, another significant finding is that within the past 10 years, President Barack Obama's administration passed gay marriage, and based on some of my interviewees who either married a same-sex partner or know of others who have in the past years, has become not only a way to gain citizenship in the United States, but to also live less tacitly or more openly and comfortably as U.S. citizens. While these are hopeful signs of a more tolerant sexual diversity within the Ironbound neighborhood, this paper points out the limits behind a standing heteronormative neoliberal ideology of good ethnicity and individual market-driven success that continues to impact queer individual and communal life. In effect, I examine in this paper how my interviewees' everyday lives value individual self-sufficiency, worth, the worth as being distinguished as a model worker, and gay marriage that are complicit with heteronormativity, limiting urgent forms of queer communal building. That is, the individualistic approach to everyday life in the Ironbound limits the potential of anti-heteronormative and anti-homonormative queer communal living I explore in this paper. For example, while gay marriage shows to be a step in the right direction to legalize, it also resembles homonormative or gay middle-class status of individualized values of self-sufficiency and family. I argue that in the past 10 years, queer Brazilians living in the Ironbound have gained a less tacit, here's my argument. I argue that in the past 10 years, queer Brazilians living in the Ironbound have gained a less tacit and more openly queer visibility and racial diversity when looking at consumer culture, work ethic, the passing of gay marriage, and nightlife culture. Despite this less marginalized positioning, queer Brazilians living in the neighborhood remain complicit to a heteronormative dominant culture of neoliberal individual and family self-sufficiency and good citizenship that discourages communal queer building around urgent needs and political coalescing within Newark. This paper is divided into two larger sections. In the first section, I offer before and after profiles of 4 of my former interviewees. I examine the ways these interviewees refine or not a heteronormative or homonormative narrative of individual self-sufficiency, worth, and or individual family life. In the second section, I weave interviewees' perspectives on several themes discussed with each of them in these recorded interviews. The themes featured are generation shifts of openness and visibility among queers, nightlife, and political organizing in the Ironbound. So my first interviewee, Joe Wilson, model worker at Bom Pão, the model worker at Bom Pão. Joe Wilson is now in his early 50s. He is of Afro-Brazilian and Portuguese descent who was born in the department of Minas Gerais, Brazil. When I met him in 2008, he was working at Bom Pão, where he continues working. At the time, Joe Wilson was undocumented and had no means of applying for legalization. Today, Joe Wilson remains undocumented, but is in the process of applying for a VAWA, Violence Against Women's Act, self-petition from his unsuccessful and abusive marriage with his African-American husband, Richard. Quite recently, his case was accepted by Immigration Equality, a nonprofit immigration firm in New York City. When I first interviewed Joe Wilson, I found that he was reticent to talk about his identity as an Afro-Brazilian or his engagement with other African Americans in Newark or elsewhere within the United States. Yet in my recent engagements with him, he was evidently more open and forthright about his personal connections with African Americans and his own identity as Black. For example, he explained to me that one very positive memory while married with his husband was meeting his African American family. Joe Wilson felt drawn to his family and it reminded him of his in Brazil. In effect, this is an indication to me that Joe Wilson is relating with US Blackness and does move away from the overall racialized whiteness and heteronormativity of the Ironbound market and neighborhood. Even though Joe Wilson is undeniably queer, effeminate, and soft-spoken, his tacit demeanor in public preserves his persona as remaining complicit to the heteronormative public of Ironbound's market. In Brazil, Joe Wilson was the target of constant ridicule and harassment at school and work because of his effeminate disposition. Even more, he found it very difficult to maintain his professional jobs as an educator because of the deep homophobia he encountered there. After arriving to the Ironbound and finding employment at Bom Pão, he explains, "I continue working at Bom Pão because of the comfort. It is a place that accepts me as a human being, that accepts me for having homosexual friends, and to also have the ability to express my points of view with my colleagues at work, my boss, and with my community." Here, Joe Wilson reflects like he did in 2009 about the high level of comfort he has at Bom Pão to be just as he is without facing discrimination or bullying by his boss or coworkers. In effect, the boss has created a tolerant work environment for Joe Wilson and others like Fernando over the years, despite the fact that people with different religious views also work there. Joe Wilson says that the work atmosphere now é paraíso, existe as diferenças. It isn't a paradise, there exist differences, because fervent evangelicals work there too. Yet overall, there are several queer employees at the bakery, and thus it is not surprising that they also would find the work environment affirming and comfortable despite evident religious differences. However, even while Bom Pão is a favorable place to work because of the queer-friendly environment, Joe Wilson describes the downsides to working there. He admits financially, "I think I'm not satisfied with working at Bom Pão." He has been working there for nearly 15 years, and the wages are insufficient to raise his quality of life or consider future plans for savings or retirement. Joe Wilson continues to live in cramped studio apartments. The one I visited this time is in a basement without any windows. Despite these downsides, he says, quote, "There are other reasons why I have stayed there, like a sense of feeling so dependable and loyal the boss feels him," end quote. In other words, he has stayed there because of his strong sense of market worth by his boss, who has successfully run a small local business with Joe Wilson's exemplary model work dependability. Many in the community know Joe Wilson working for years at the bakery, and because of this, he has gained a public status as an efficient hard worker despite any prejudices about his effeminacy and sexual orientation. As an efficient worker, Joe Wilson remains a safe and known public figure who is not threatening to anyone in the community, nor planning on being reactive in any way, but remaining complicit to the everyday life and work in the Ironbound market. See the public organizing section later. So the next section is Carlos and Kevin in The Real Deal, the model gay marriage. When I met Carlos in 2006, he was an undocumented, early 20-year-old something living in the Ironbound. When he arrived into the neighborhood, he started in the construction business to pay off his $9,000 coyote fee for entering the United States undocumented. In the local male heterosexist labor workforce that is construction, Carlos stayed just enough to pay off his debt and moved into an independent domestic cleaning in New York City. Which he would do for the rest of his time while living in New Jersey until he moved with his husband in 2017 to Florida. Around 2009, Carlos applied for political asylum based on sexual orientation persecution in Brazil. But after gay marriage passed, Carlos and his husband, Kevin, eventually decided that they should marry and discontinue the asylum process because it was taking too long. Eventually, Carlos became a U.S. resident through gay marriage, and last year, the married couple went to Brazil to visit Carlos's family in Minas Gerais. Carlos has not seen his family in over 15 years. Carlos's experience going back to Brazil for a week with his husband was very positive. Aside from Kevin's limited Portuguese ability, he felt right at home and got along very well with Carlos's parents. Kevin is Italian-American and was born and raised in Pennsylvania. He is a monolingual English speaker. Carlos's young niece adores Kevin and always asks him first when they talk through Skype. Carlos's family knows the long and committed relationship that Carlos and Kevin have established for over 10 years. They met at a gay club called Feathers in River Edge, New Jersey. As they grew more serious, they lived together in the Ironbound while Carlos was undocumented. Even as a couple with different statuses, this does not affect their plans to build a household together. At first, they lived in a basement apartment and eventually rented an apartment in a two-family house for several years before they made the decision to move out of the Ironbound and buy a home in suburban New Jersey. Both men wanted to eventually move out of densely populated and crime-ridden Ironbound. Carlos complained about cars constantly being broken into and vandalized, or how black and brown youth from North Newark come and mug people on Ironbound streets. Before they went ahead and looked for a home, many of their friends in the Ironbound discouraged them from leaving the Ironbound. Both Carlos and Kevin had made up their minds. Eventually, they would buy their first home in Broadway, New Jersey, and then their second home in Plainfield, New Jersey, before they would move to a town 2 hours outside of Miami and purchase a self-designed and freshly built 5-bedroom, 4-bedroom home there. Nearby alligators, by the way. The alligators are nearby. However, at the time of the first interview with Carlos in 2008, he was already disillusioned with life in the Ironbound in terms of the density and the rising crime. More importantly, he wanted to move out from the Ironbound away from Brazilians and experience living the American mainstream. It is evident that his goal to move out of the Ironbound is a sense of personal success, progress, and mobility. In our recent talks in Florida, he expresses his critical view over his long-time queer friends, some who are in committed relationships and remain paying rent in the Ironbound without any motivation to pursue home ownership and wealth. Wealth from ownership, right? In effect, Carlos finds these friends as limiting their progress or not working hard enough in U.S. by remaining in the Ironbound. Over the years that Carlos and Kevin have moved out of the Ironbound, they had less and less interaction with their friends. Carlos was the central figure of sociability among his queer friends when he lived in the Ironbound, but this slowly changed after leaving the Ironbound and is virtually non-existent while living in Florida. When I first approached this topic of returning to visit the Ironbound and rekindling with friends who still live there, Carlos was not optimistic and disinterested. He commented that his friends were full of drama, envious of his mobility, and basically still up to the same things, over partying, overspending, hooking up. He was doing these kinds of things 10 years ago. Carlos's and Kevin's communication with these groups of friends is through social media mostly, and very infrequent over phone. But the more we spent remembering the Ironbound, the more Carlos seemed to grow nostalgic over it, about the good times with his friends at local eateries, karaoke nights, home parties he threw, including visits to Asbury Park. They used to hang out at Paradise, for example. When he realized that I was going back for a second time this past summer and reminisced about these memories, he wanted to go back when he at first seemed disinterested about even returning to visit. In effect, Carlos and Kevin have moved themselves away from the communal life among queer friends and built an individualized family as mobilized homonormative immigrants. So my next interview is Nelson, the older, self-sufficient, and passing for straight and formal businessman. Nelson, who is 59 years old, is the eldest of my interviewees. I met Nelson at Lutheran Church in the Ironbound that we used to visit, where I met a number of Brazilian queers, including Carlos. It is at this church where we would try to form AGNUSA, Associação Gay Ironbound Newark, USA. Also, we've discussed in the organizing section. In 2008, Nelson was undocumented. It would not be around 2012 when he would arrange a marriage agreement with a Brazilian woman to become legalized. Nelson, a Brazilian of European descent, who was born and raised in southern Brazil, successfully passes as a white, straight-acting male. Because he can perform a heterosexual masculinity, Nelson was able to convince immigration authorities that his marriage to this woman was authentic. Nelson recently has gained legal permanent residency. Since my last engagement with him in 2009, Nelson has been in a relationship with Louis, a Jewish-American private attorney whose practice is based in New York City. Nelson met Louis on a dating site online, and after some dating and sexual intimacy, they began seeing each other. Sexually, Nelson is the active partner, and Louis is the bottom partner. Also, Louis hired Nelson for his cleaning services. Louis saw how meticulous Nelson is as a domestic cleaner and even helped him to think about marketing himself more professionally, using aromatherapy with his cleaning services that would attract a corporate class living in the city. However, Nelson remained informal and did not follow Louis's sophisticated business savvy. Even while Nelson remains informal with his domestic cleaning services, he has been very successful working 3 to 4 cleaning jobs in one day and up to 6 days a week. Over the holidays, Nelson receives bonuses from his clients that he always saved. In all, he has been able to save significant life savings over these years while sending generous monthly remittances and building a comfortable home for his three sisters in Brazil. Both his parents died by 2008, and he could not visit them before because he was undocumented. A lot of his ability to save stems from being frugal. For example, he has been renting a room in the same 4-bedroom apartment since I met him in 2006. By 2009, the landlord made him in charge of all the subleases in the apartment, and as a result, he was able to avoid paying rent while charging the other subleasers a higher rent for their rooms to cover his rent. Nelson continues living in the same apartment near Ferry Street. While Carlos thinks that he should move out because he has the means to, Nelson looks at living in the Ironbound as very convenient, having everything at his fingertips, including Brazilian food, his ethnic culture, and public transportation to New York City. Nelson, for example, has never had a car while living in the United States because he has lived in the Ironbound, which is a transportation hub for Metro New York, New Jersey. Unlike Carlos, who wanted to move out of the Ironbound and exude progress, Nelson is committed to stay in the Ironbound and does not care about building a more comfortable life in the U.S. now as a legal resident with the means that he's able to do so. Despite Nelson's financial success and business integrity, Louis has found him, according to Nelson, to be much below his league. For example, Nelson explains that Louis has behaved in ways that demonstrate he is embarrassed to be Nelson's boyfriend because of his modest work and the fact that he was a Brazilian undocumented immigrant. It has taken Louis a long time to introduce Nelson to his friends and parents, and it was left unestablished that they were actually together. Even so, Nelson has proven to be financially dependable for Louis. In one instance, some years back, when Louis needed $15,000 because he was in between checks, Nelson was able to take out $15,000 from his savings account so that Louis could borrow them. Even more, Carlos has started a new business selling fancy jewelry from Brazil to mostly women and queers in hair salons throughout Newark. On some days, he's able to make up to $1,000 in a single day. This has allowed him to work 4 days a week in cleaning and the rest of the week selling jewelry directly from Brazil to his established clientele in the Ironbound and nearby Harrison and Kearny. Nelson mentions that the women and queer men in the salons have asked him, "Are you married? Are you gay?" But he is discreetly professional and straight acting compared to the eccentric men in the hair salons. In one occasion, one of the men in the hair salon was trying to fit a ring that Nelson was selling him, and he said, "This does not fit, quote, this does not fit my finger, but it fits my clitoris," end quote. Nelson of course laughs at his eccentric remark, but even so, he is reserved about his own sexuality with them. In effect, this new small business endeavor is all the more reason why Nelson will remain in the Ironbound. Louis finds it off-putting that Nelson continues living in the, quote, roach-ridden apartment in Newark, end quote, when he can live somewhere else more decent. Currently, Louis lives in a posh apartment in Cliffside Park, New Jersey, overlooking New York City, and pays $4,000 a month in rent. I know rents are pretty high nowadays here anyway, so I don't even know if $4,000 is a lot of money. But Nelson visits Louis on the weekends, but he does not feel the need to aspire for better living. Rather, he chooses practicality and convenience over luxury and status. Given Louis's and Nelson's different walks of life and social positionings, it has complicated the relationship in the past, but in my last interview, Nelson affirms that they have come a long way despite these stark social differences. Danilo, a promoter and entertainer for all in the Ironbound, my last interview here. Danilo has been living in the Ironbound since the very early 2000s, hanging out with Brazilians in the local scene early on. He got a break from one friend who decided to move back to Brazil. She hosted a karaoke night that Danilo frequented. Seeing great potential in him to host, she told him, quote, Danilo, I'm leaving back to Brazil for good, but I'm going to pretend I'm coming back, and in the meantime, you could host and take over the karaoke night, end quote. This friend left him with her karaoke equipment, which he would use for years later. Since that moment, Danilo remained an entertainer, host and promoter for different establishments in the neighborhood for over 15 years. Danilo explains how his public stature as a host and entertainer grew bigger over time. He says, quote, my main job is still karaoke. That's where I started. So doing karaoke and people seeing the singing and then the energy, they started inviting me to do shows, openings, festivals, Brazilian festivals, end quote. He has created game nights at several of these establishments, including Brasilia Grill, Guitar Bar, and Rosie's Bars, which I will get into later. Here, Danilo offers his goals about what being a host, entertainer, and promoter in the Ironbound means to him. That resonates with his ability to bring people together. He says, quote, my work is bringing a variety of happy moments to people that come from Brazil or from other countries. This is a Brazilian neighborhood. Everyone comes, the Brazilians, the Hispanics, and Americans, end quote. And that's my main goal, and that's my main goal, is working the nightlife, bringing in a little bit of happiness, end quote. Danilo describes happy moments of ethnic mixing among different groups here. These moments comprise Danilo's work to help create not only individual happiness, but also a positive ethnic mixing in these spaces of entertainment. By him saying a little bit of happiness, Danilo is suggesting how this healthy mixing of racial democracy is temporary amidst everyday individual life and work under neoliberal society. Byron, a new interview who arrived in the Ironbound in 1998, offers his view about Danilo's legacy with hosting parties in the Ironbound. He comments, quote, Danilo has done so much because, he goes bar to bar with his karaoke thing and he would gather all kinds of people together. He does that. He brings people together, end quote. In effect, Byron's view that Danilo, quote, has done so much to ease tensions and hostilities and create familiarity instead among the ethnic diversity of those in the Ironbound as residents and consumers. Specifically, Joelson adds that Danilo, quote, is involved with the gay community because when he does events, the gay community joins him where he goes. He's super personable, right, with the gay community. For example, if he has an event in Casa Nova, the gay community will also join because he is super personable with the gay community. In this discussion, I proceed to ask him if the party is straight, gay, or mixed. He explains that it is uma mistura, or mixed, quote, because he is super personable with all, and so the gay community joins him, end quote. In effect, Joelson establishes here Danilo's ability to create events of peaceful sexual diversity. But even more, Joelson explains, ele é uma pessoa formadora do opinião, end quote. Or, as a publicly, openly gay man, in other words, an openly gay man whose opinions and perspectives are valued as a public community figure within the Ironbound. In other words, his ability to build mixed parties of sexual diversity has helped create a peaceful cohabitation in the dense neighborhood of the Ironbound. Danilo has been catering to different racial and ethnic groups, especially Latinos, Hispanophones in the Ironbound for many years, not just to Brazilian, Lusophone-speaking residents of the neighborhood. While many of his parties play mostly Brazilian music at Brasilia Grill. I lost my line here. While many of his parties play mostly Brazilian funk at Brasilia Grill, many of his other parties play Latino-inspired music like reggaeton, bachata, and house music. Depending on the amount of Latinos who attend the parties, the sets between Brazilian, Latino, and American music vary. For example, at Guitar Bar, more Latinos than Brazilians went to his Rainbow Tuesday nights. Guitar Bar was a bar that closed in 2011. For example, at Guitar Bar, more Latinos than Brazilians went to his Rainbow Tuesday nights. While Danilo creates a nightlife of racial and sexual diversity where people dance and sing peacefully in ways that does not happen in everyday life, it is an apolitical and safe nightlife consumption that remains complicit with the neoliberal ideology of individual values, sufficiency, and work. So my last section is Weaving Perspectives. The title is Weaving Perspectives, Comfy Queers, Queer Communal Groupings, and Possibilities in the Nightlife. I asked Byron How has the Ironbound changed or not in terms of gay people living there? Byron responds, I don't think it's changed much, but it did change. You definitely see more gays around. Here, Byron addresses that even while you see more gays around, the dominant culture remains heteronormative. I ask him further, describe that. What do you mean? He responds, you can see gays holding hands. Like a couple of months ago, they had the Portuguese festival. I see 2 girls holding hands and I see 2 guys holding hands. In 2009, I don't think we saw that. Byron explains that here that more visibility and openness has risen as far as same-sex queer identity in public amidst nationalist and immigrant heteronormative festivals like the annual Portuguese Festival. Byron's attendance of the Portuguese Festival demonstrates how Brazilians and Portuguese commingle in different public Lusophone events in the Ironbound, and therefore how queer identity is shared and experienced in them too. Similarly, Joe Wilson describes an open intimacy now that did not really exist among clients at Bone Pound Bakery around 2009. I asked him, we were in this conversation, the queer females and male youth clients kiss at the bakery now, or no? Yes, in the mouth, the face. They come to the bakery holding hands. When they are waiting to be served, I see them extending their hands at each other and caressing each other. These kinds of activities before did not exist, and now they do. It's a shift in behavior as much as for gays and as for lesbians. In my discussion with Byron, I proceed to ask him, why do you think this visibility and openness is happening? He responds, LGBTQ community is now more. I think they're opening more and more. It's helping everyone to be open. The new generation has a totally different mentality. It's like, who cares what they are? Danilo shares overall the same impressions that Byron has by saying, you see more gays in the area here than before. Unlike Byron, Danilo focuses this visibility and openness with the context of a local popular Brazilian restaurant, Delicias do Minas, where he says that over at least 70% of the employees are queer. Very much like Joelson at Bone Pound, Danilo describes a very comfortable work environment for these gay workers and clients. For example, he tells that the queer workers, do funny things. The waiters and bartenders, they have this funk Brazilian music that have steps. They all come to the front and they dance. The guys come, they dance, and they do the twerking thing. Brazilian twerk, and are living their best lives. End quote. In effect, these queer workers go shamelessly to the front and openly flaunt the safe space of a gay-tolerant run restaurant business amidst a heterosexual majority clientele. However, this sense of openness within a heteronormative market space contains these workers to perform a safe and consumable queerness in which Brazilian funk and twerking are familiar to a heteronormative majority clientele too. Queer organizing in the Ironbound, onde está eles com esto, which translates as queer organizing in the Ironbound. Where are they with this? In this section, I offer 3 perspectives about where organizing among queers in the Ironbound is. Joelson offers a more historical perspective, as you'll see, as far as an actual initiative that occurred in 2008. Byron raises his recent attempt to attend the Gay Pride event in downtown Newark with a friend and learns new information from our discussion. Joelson offers a historical context. Listen, unfortunately, what queers attempted to do during that time, almost 10 years ago, unfortunately was not realized or forged. The community stopped moving in that direction. Right now, there isn't a social political organization for the gay community in the Ironbound, end quote.